Hello, my name is Kieran Pearce and I lead the Multi-Schools Council, which is all about listening to the voices of young people. And it's something I set up back in 2012. And the reason for setting it up was while I was working at a special needs school within Essex, a young girl approached one day and said that the support she and her friends got was brilliant, but that one day she and her friends had to leave that setting. And simply other young people, other adults, other professionals didn't understand what it meant to have learning differences. And so we set about setting up ways to go into schools and educate others about our differences. And that work has really evolved since then. We now work across the Essex local authority with young people in all different parts of Essex, and working with professionals to help improve that awareness. The reason for talking here today is to have a focus around anxiety and stress, and especially the impact of that on young people with neurodiversity. So we take in lots of feedback from young people throughout our sessions, whether that be in schools or through our ambassador program, where young people may join us outside of the school gates, but also through working with other professionals across education, health and social care. So today's session is meant to touch on a few of those issues, to give you some time to think about things that young people want you to think about, and hopefully raise some questions that you can raise with other colleagues as well, and get you to really think about some of the things that young people, as I say, are really keen for us to talk about. So the session is going to focus on the areas that you can see on the screen now. Obviously, I'd much rather be doing this session with you in person. Apologies that I can't be with you. But hopefully, as I say, it will still allow you time to pause and just to have a little think about some of the things that young people do want you to focus on. So there's a few areas that we're going to touch on and bring in some of the work that we have done recently and over a period of time. So we've got our school attendance report, which I'm going to touch on, and obviously has some strong links into mental health and especially stress and anxiety. We've done a recent piece of work around health improvement. So looking from young people's perspectives and some key focus questions around how health services could improve in general. And that feedback went to the NHSE National Improvement Send Board, which is looking to drive those changes forward. So I will elaborate a little bit more on that as we go through. We've also got some feedback from our autism, ADHD and mental health work in schools. And we are going to focus on masking. It's an area that our ambassadors really want us to focus on at the moment and are really keen for us to link into this presentation today. So we will have a discussion around that and some feedback and some thoughts from young people. So we're going to start with the attendance report. So to give you a bit of background on this, during the summer of 2022, we worked with schools, again, across Essex, young people from primary, mainstream, secondary schools, and from special schools, pupil referral units, all types of settings. We were able to speak to around 300 young people who gave their views on school attendance. And obviously what that helped us to do was to look firstly at what might help keep some young people in school, but also what were some of the things that were detracting from young people wanting to be in school. And a lot of that did link into mental health and mental well-being, and breaking down some of the real key reasons of why young people may not want to attend school. Now, obviously, there's many different elements to this, and we're only just picking out the things relevant for today. But I think it's really important to bear in mind that obviously it's very individual. Although we're trying to collate this information, give an overview, attendance at school is something that is very individual and there's lots of factors. One of the big things that was spoken about from young people was anxiety. And I think one of the things we really wanted to drill down to was anxiety can have lots of different meanings for different people. And what we want to try and really understand when we work with young people is, can we identify the source? So where has that anxiety come from? And what does that actually mean for an individual? As I say, the amount of young people we spoke to, anxiety meant a range of different things. And I think our advice to professionals from the feedback we've had is, can we really identify it? And is it a feeling of anxiety, or is it a feeling of worry? Or is it a feeling of happiness, but they're just not quite sure how to explain that and what that actual feeling means to them? Now, we know from a lot of our work that feelings in general and understanding feelings can be sometimes quite challenging. So it is about using our resources around us to break that down. But sometimes that word anxiety can start to stick with children. And in essence, that creates more anxiety as such, because they're not really sure what that feeling means for them. So a lot of our work at the moment is really starting to get schools to really try and consider, what do young people feel anxiety means? And if there is a particular individual as well, what does that anxiety mean for that individual? We spoke lots in the report about having a more therapeutic approach within schools. And when we spoke about therapy here, we weren't talking initially about kind of one-to-one support that young people were after. This was about the whole ethos and the whole environment of that school, and actually thinking about, on a day-to-day basis, how do we interact with young people? How do we ensure they feel safe? And we'll come to more of that throughout this presentation. I think something that was really clear was that we talked lots, especially in our autism sessions, around context and how young people may be looking at the world through a different context. And actually, when it comes to school attendance, there may be some things that are just expected of a young person to understand or to grasp or fall into, almost those routines that we might just think are the norm. But for some of the young people we spoke to, actually that norm in their minds was very different, and they couldn't understand the context of why something was being done or delivered in that way. And that then caused stress in terms of not really understanding the full picture. We do a lot of work with adults as well in our line of work, and we talk lots about, again, safety and what helps you to feel safe. And a lot of responses we get back are around having a bit of a plan and understanding what is going on. So then we flip that, and if young people don't understand what is happening throughout their day, especially when it applies to school, or they don't have a bit of a plan in their minds, and that can cause a lot of barriers. So it's thinking here about, again, is there a clear plan? Do they understand the context of a different situation? The biggest barrier to young people with additional needs was bullying. So in terms of our work, we're trying to respond to that at the moment with schools. We've developed some anti-bullying assemblies that we're rolling out officially from September. And it's really, again, making sure that we will have a focus on that, not just in education, but across all sectors. I think especially in education, looking at schools and how we deal with those types of things. So again, that understanding of difference is so important. You know, when we don't ever talk about differences or neurodiversity, that's then when those barriers start to appear through ignorance, you know, not having that understanding and that information. So making sure that we're doing some work there, because we know that bullying will have a massive impact on stress and anxiety. I think one of the things that came out from young people as well was the breakdown in connection with parents, maybe between schools and the home, as kind of a fallout from the impact of COVID. In that obviously a lot of more things were done separately, and actually, again, how we then get parents back involved within the school and local communities as well, because they felt that the more connection there was there, the reduced anxiety and stress there was, not just on that young person, but on their family as a whole. So I think that was something important to reflect on as well, that stress and anxiety might not actually be coming from that young person themselves, but could be passed down from whoever they are within the home. So really important to kind of bear that in mind as well. Preparation and information does really link into the context again. So, you know, how do we understand how young people will understand the information that's being given to them? So do we need to break it down slightly? Are we looking more at visual information here, or do we need to explain it in a different way? So again, if we can paint a clear picture, first of all, we may be able to reduce that anxiety and stress. We know that change can cause anxiety and stress, not just for young people, but for adults as well. And again, thinking about how we prepare young people for change, those transition points that we may talk about. Again, do we do enough work around that to reduce some of that stress and anxiety? One of the things I always talk about in schools, and I'll probably hold my hands up and say I may have done this in the past, a young person may come up to us and say they're worried about something that may be happening in, let's say, 10 months' time. And a response from us might be, oh, well, we don't need to worry about that yet. But actually, if that young person's coming to us now, that is a worry for them right now, even if it is in the future. So it's about not dismissing and how we address. And we may not be able to have a solution to every worry or everything that might form a kind of stress or anxiety response, but at least we are starting to address it. And then that's the way we're getting to the root, first of all, and understand where that's coming from. Sensory needs, I think, is a big thing in terms of a school environment. It can be very overwhelming. They can be obviously very busy places, and again, it's about helping schools to understand what are the sensory needs of those young people, those individuals, and making sure, again, those resources are in place, and we can break down what we need to make sure that that young person gets what they need, and ultimately, if those needs aren't being met, again, that can result in many different responses from that young person. We've done a lot of work recently in terms of understanding young people's needs from a range of areas. And I think toileting is something that keeps coming up in terms of young people, where maybe, again, those needs aren't being met, the impact that can have on toileting and issues associated with that. And again, helping schools to understand that as well. So we know our body will respond in different ways when we're stressed. And it's about making sure, again, schools have that information and young people have the resources to be able to express that. So I think there's a lot of understanding that needs to go into that. And I think hopefully, in the next couple of years, we can really start to try and push that from different angles in terms of understanding different toileting needs of young people. So having a look here at the impact of, obviously, some of the things we've just mentioned, and then also some of the interventions that within the report we're suggesting schools to really have a focus on. So I think obviously the impact of these things not working is the non-attendance, and we know that there can be different ways for young people to learn, and obviously learning from home is an option. We're not dismissing that at all, that can work really well for some young people. We also know that some young people could actually benefit a lot more from being in school, and there's some good reasons for them to be there if some of the interventions could be put in place. But obviously non-attendance is one of the impacts. A distrust in the system. So, if you start to move away from something like that, that can paint a picture of what the system might or might not be able to do for you in the future. And then, there's a bigger disconnect, which ultimately won't be helpful for that young person. And an unmet need, and that might be the needs with their education might be better met, but socially those needs then aren't being met. And although that may be okay in some situations, in others that may have a real negative impact on that young person. A lack of communication skills in terms of how they're able to communicate with different people, if they're not able to attend. Mental health challenges, so research to show that that can really have a knock-on effect in terms of the lack of social interaction, lack of being able to have an education. The impact that can then have on people's mental health is massive. The peer-to-peer rejection then, so again, not being part of a group, not being able to socialize with others in a way that works for them. And as I mentioned, that kind of food and sleep issues as well. So lots of research, again, to show that the impact on, anxiety and stress in terms of lack of eating or sleep issues. And we'll come more to that as we go through this session as well. So interventions, we spoke about just some of them here, and I'll give you a link to our website where you can read the full report if it's something you're interested in terms of school attendance. The culture shift in terms of making sure there's an ask from schools around, there's not an expectation that young people have to be in school, but actually they want to be in school. So why should young people want to be in school, and how do we get young people feeling safe, wanting to be there? And that safe space will fit into that as well. So again, one of the things we ask schools is, have you got a safe space? If I went into your school, would a young person be able to tell me where that safe space is? Anti-bullying work as well, I think, is really important. As I said, we've got the assemblies. We're also encouraging schools to make sure they're speaking to a diverse group of young people, and involving them in their anti-bullying policy. Some schools will do things like anti-bullying ambassadors and different ways of doing it. And I think it's really important we don't lose sight of that was a real big reason why young people may not be attending school, and impacting on their stress and anxiety levels as well. As I've already mentioned, have we really explored the word anxiety? Are we engaging with parents? And what are our communication methods? We know one size does not fit all. And when we're talking about neurodiversity, obviously this comes into play even more so. And making sure that we have different ways of communicating with young people, and we're really focusing on that as well. So just a few things here to mention. I know I've just got to summarize today, but looking at school attendance, the impact that can have, and how we might be able to support some of that as well. So the next area I'm going to touch on is health feedback. So as I said, we did some work with just under 100 young people in a very short space of time, looking at general questions in terms of health services, what they want to see in terms of improvement, what were some of the challenges, and what were some of the positives as well. And for this session, I'm just going to focus on some of the things that they felt are having an impact, again, linking that into stress and anxiety. And again, just some food for thought for people that are on the call today. So I think one of the things that came out really clearly was not being prepared for appointments. And obviously that could be a range of appointments, from going to see the doctor, from going to the dentist, whatever it may be in terms of linking to their health. But again, how that may link into anxiety and stress responses. So there's a bit of a pattern here already, isn't there, between the things of lack of preparation and not really having a clear plan. And again, reflected on how we give young people that information and how we do it. So, just by telling some young people, we know that that's not going to be a way that is going to work for them. Again, how do we show that visually, for example? So making sure we're thinking about how we display information really importantly. The waiting times is something that kind of speaks for itself. I think as adults, we're all acutely aware. But knowing that can have an impact, if they're waiting for the right support, they're not getting it. I think lots of people's frustrations, I'm sure, are if they can't get to that support that they need, or they can't get to that appointment, what is there in the medium term to support, or in the short term to support that young person? It shouldn't just be, well, here's the waiting list, thank you very much. So making sure we work with partners to really understand that. And I know certain areas have really looked at that pathway and what that looks like locally. And that's something that young people really want to see happening more of. Unclear language, again, how professionals may use language when they speak to them directly, making sure we have an understanding of where young people are at with their understanding themselves and how we might be able to break things down, which kind of links into the two clinical response. So where the language is maybe overly clinical, and again, it hasn't been broken down for young people to understand the impact that can have on their stress and anxiety of a certain situation. And that could be very much reduced just by that change of language. So are we on the same page? Or if we are talking to the adults, how we give the adults support to give the right information to the young people so the young people understand that. Really, really important to consider. I think, again, something that really stood out was young people saying about how health professionals may not really know about them. And when they see them, that doesn't really give them much confidence, because they're almost scratching their heads of, why am I here? Is this professional really going to understand what I need? So having a real clear picture and making sure things like, one-page profiles, for example, are really clear, and professionals may have access to that, so they know a little bit about that young person, and we can build those connections and relationships, which again can really help to reduce some of those stress and anxiety responses from what young people tell us. I think preparing for future, we again touched on it slightly in the last section, but again, do young people have access to that information? So many young people we speak to may get a diagnosis, and then it's never explained to them what that diagnosis means. That can be very scary. And again, that can create a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, and that could be resolved if things were broken down. And there was a little bit of, guidance on what does this mean for me? And obviously that would be individual, but if we can get that information there, health professionals feeling confident to give that information, again, that could really help to reduce some of that stress and anxiety. And that's why it is about understanding that diagnosis is so important. As part of our role going into schools, helping young people have a basic overview, but that still needs to be broken down individually on a one-to-one basis. I think the big thing in terms of what we're really talking to services about all of the time, and the sound bites that come from young people, is that early intervention word that always comes up. And I mean, just to summarize it, the quote on the screen, I think it summarizes it really well, that if we're always looking at putting our resources to, halfway down that river, we're really not understanding why people are falling in the first place. And I think, again, something like stress and anxiety, it keeps going back to that starting point. Can we find where that may have come from? Now, there are going to be certain situations that do just, our natural responses can cause us to feel more stressed or to feel more anxious. And then it's seeing those things in isolation, but then also looking at the tools of how we might be able to manage those situations. But then with other things that may go on over a longer period of time, is thinking about that river and how we get in early. So we're really keen, and I think when we talk to some health professionals about this who are really honest, that again, even that send awareness in that professional kind of area and arena is not always as strong as it could be, and we need to really be thinking about how we change that. One of our big frustrations is that there may be resources, support that's put in place, maybe aiming it at young people who don't have neurodiversity, and then afterwards it's then thought about how we might adapt that resource or that response, and it's too late then. So actually thinking firstly, how is this going to be applicable to all young people? How can we adapt it and make it accessible for all? And I think that's something that we will continue pushing, and making sure young people have a real strong voice in that, because the only way we can understand that is if we listen to young people themselves. So I'm going to focus now on autism, and as I say, that there's so much that we go into, and I'm really just trying to simplify and break it down as much as I can in the time that I've been given today. So as I say, we do go into schools and we deliver workshops to young people around autism. We also offer staff CPD, and we obviously work with a lot of young people who have autism as part of our ambassador program. So where young people get involved in different projects outside of school. And some things to really link in here in terms of stress and anxiety and mental health overall as well. So I think one of the big things young people talk to us about is the negative portrayal of autism and what it might mean for them, and socially how that may be seen, and the impact again that can have on their mental health. So the negative connotations of every autistic person is going to do this or do that, or look like this or act like this. And it's about making sure again that we really get that language out there in terms of autism is very different for each young person, and if you've met one young person with autism, you've only met one young person with autism. It's that type of language, and making sure that everybody is seen as different, which then transpires into the one size fits all approach doesn't work, and making sure we have those adaptive responses. And I think again, some of this is repeated in terms of the different slides, but it's because it's so clearly coming from our young people in terms of that lack of adaptive communication and understanding. So when we are responding to young people, there's a barrier there. If we don't have those communication skills, we don't feel that we have the resources, etc. That's going to be a massive barrier, which then can result in that stress and anxiety. So just stopping and thinking, as a professional, as a team, how are we adapting our communication to make sure that we're meeting the needs of these different young people, and how we retain that information, but also how young people retain the information that we're giving them. So some of the young people we were really talking to recently were talking about how if something's explained to them once, that doesn't work. They may actually need it explained a few times so they can really store that. And although that's extra work and extra time, if that extra work and extra time is put in the first place, then there's not that negative experience later down the line because they haven't really understood the message. And that negative experience down the line may very well much be more stress, more anxiety, because they haven't understood that information that's been given to them first, and they haven't been able to retain that and then apply it to whatever situation that may be. So again, really important to understand how young people are retaining that information, and we may need to repeat that. It's not just we're going to give this to a young person first of all. And these were some of the things that really came out from the young people we work with who have a diagnosis of autism. I would have loved to have been with you in person, as I've already said, because just talking at you straight, it does seem a little bit much, and I don't want you to get bored of my voice. So I'm just going to do a little activity here as well, which hopefully you can just try within this session. And it's a session, it's an activity that we do within our autism awareness sessions for school staff. And he's just getting us to, again, to reflect on some of the things that can really impact on those stress and anxiety kind of responses, and kind of looking at where that may come from as well. So I want you to imagine that you walk into a room full of people you don't know. So for some of you already on this call, you might be thinking, absolutely no way, no thank you, Kieran. The lights are bright, the food on the menu is seafood, and the room is very loud and full of conversation. So there's lots of things happening. One room is hot and one is cold, so you can't decide if you want to keep your jacket on or take it off. And you can't read anyone's emotions. So you know if people are happy, sad, angry, you just don't know. And some of the language you use, you just simply don't understand. So you can almost imagine you're in a foreign country and you don't speak that language. And that would be my question to you all. And no alcohol is allowed. I think we've put that on there because that may be how some adults get through difficult social situations. Obviously, young people don't have that choice. So we're going to break this down and have a little look at what this might mean for young people. And again, then how that might link into stress and anxiety. So the walking into a room full of people you don't know, again, we talk in schools, and sorry if this is too schools focused, but I think we can take the learning and apply it to lots of different situations. If you think about in a classroom where a young person may be for long periods of that day, especially in a primary setting, they get used to that environment, they get used to the people around them. Maybe they do start to feel more comfortable. But then if we take that and look at a school assembly, for example, they've then got to go into a different room where they don't go much. There's lots more people. There's people they haven't interacted with before. They don't really understand them. That's a very, very different experience. So it's looking at the environment here and really thinking about, okay, what has changed? And actually, how do we approach that? Is it something we need to break down in small steps? Do we need to do it preparation? It's that preparation word again, to reduce some of that anxiety around what this new experience might feel like. So just going and visiting the hall space regularly, or taking some pictures and sharing those regularly. Again, thinking about how we give that information is really important. Again, the lights and the food, etc. I give my own personal story on this one. So I remember working with a young boy before in a school who was pre-verbal, and every lunchtime he wasn't eating his lunch. So he had a packed lunch, and where he was eating was right next to where the school dinners were being served. The school then moved this young person to a different place in the hall, and the young person started to eat his packed lunch. Now, what we could kind of evaluate from that situation and summarize was that the smells and the noise that was coming from where the dinner was being served was just too overwhelming for that young person. And they couldn't really communicate that in a way that then the adults could understand. So the young person moved somewhere else. And as I say, that those noises, those smells have reduced, and that young person could then eat their lunch. And again, so it's about evaluating the different sensory inputs that may be having an impact on that young person. Have we really understood that? And have we observed that enough? Have we spent time to really see that? Because that, again, may link into how a child or young person feels about that experience. And it's the same with temperature. Again, you know, how temperature can change the way different people respond, and have we understood that and evaluated that? So that evaluation is really, really key because of, again, of that stress and anxiety that it may cause. As I mentioned earlier, the reading of emotions and understanding feelings is something that we know can be a real challenge in different ways, and again, in different environments. So again, thinking about the resources we might link to that to make sure that we're explaining emotions and feelings in a way that works for that young person. Because if a young person is really struggling to understand their own emotions, they're not going to understand others either most of the time. So can they relate their own emotions to themselves? And again, a strategy we spoke about in schools is you may take a picture of a young person when they're enjoying an activity, and then when they've done that activity, can you get them to relate any emotions by looking at the picture of themselves, how they may have been feeling? Now, again, that's relatable to them. I wouldn't recommend taking a picture of a child when they're angry and upset, because you're probably not going to get a good response. But what you could do is take a picture of the event, scenario, situation that you feel may have caused that response. And when they're in a better place, see if you can get them to explain how they were feeling. And again, obviously, each thing would need to be adapted depending on the ability of that young person, but making sure the essence of it and the principle is can they make it relatable to themselves, first of all. And language, as we've mentioned, is a big thing all of the time. Something we talk lots here about is the blanks level system, a really simple system that looks at where young people are on their communication journey, breaks it down at different levels, and also helps you to think about the different questions you may pose depending on where they are on their communication journey. So really important to kind of focus on that, and look at, are we going too high in terms of our language delivery, or actually could we be extending some of these young people? Because again, that is that understanding, isn't it? If we don't have that understanding, if we don't know what's being communicated to us, that can cause a lot of difficulties. So moving on to ADHD as well, and I'm trying not to make it too specific to different areas of need, and trying to just bring it all back into our focus today with mental health. So these are some of the things that we touch on that we feel have a link within our ADHD sessions. So we know a lot of young people who have a diagnosis of ADHD may also have other areas of learning need as well. We see that with over half of the young people, from the research and pictures that we see and understand. So it is about understanding that whole picture, not just focusing on one area of need, but what else is it that young person may need to access their learning. Again, removing those barriers that may reduce that stress and anxiety response. So for example, we talk about a child with ADHD who every English lesson may find it challenging to do some writing, and that adult may put it down to the fact that maybe they've lost concentration within the delivery of what's expected for that young person in the starter activity, and so that's why they're not engaging. But actually it could be that they're dyslexic and that's never been understood or never been recognized, and then we just label it as maybe one area of need. So making sure we see the whole picture and we really think about what might be impacting that young person. Really lots of research and even from our own kind of work of poor levels of self-esteem with young people with ADHD. So those really low opinions of themselves. And I will, again, before we finish, touch on the impact of that. So again, any work around boosting levels of self-esteem, giving them that better feeling amongst themselves and how that may look then amongst their peers, really important to kind of understand and consider. We all have that fight, flight, or freeze response. And often we'll find with young people who have ADHD, those responses can be activated slightly quicker. So again, thinking about those touch points, what is it that activates those responses? Can we really understand that? And do we have the support around that to recognize it? One of the things we always talk about is never dealing with a behavior at its highest point. So if a young person has gone into one of those responses and they're in that heightened state, we're not going to find a solution in that moment. So keeping them safe and getting them to a point where maybe then we can have those conversations afterwards, but not trying to find the solution at that time. We know that food and sleep are two big things in terms of the impact on a young person and how that may look then generally with their mental health, especially if they have a diagnosis of ADHD. So a couple of things, obviously sleep kind of does speak for itself in terms of a lack of sleep, and how that may portray again then into their responses in different situations, because we know what a lack of sleep can do to our brains. But also the impact of food in terms of if a young person is taking ADHD medication, for example. Lots of young people talk to us about the struggles initially with that medication, maybe getting the right dose, the impact that can have on their feeling of hunger, and then not necessarily eating at the same time as their peers. And it's about making those accommodations as well. So one thing, again, we pose to professionals is, if you as an adult and you were taking medication for whatever reason, and then you weren't feeling hungry, but were made to eat at a specific time because that's the time that was expected within that setting, you wouldn't want to eat. So it's about, again, thinking how that might feel for a young person again, and making those reasonable adjustments. So I'm going to get you just to reflect on these pictures. And if you want to pause me at this point, because again, you're getting a little bored of my voice, then you can. But usually in our sessions, I would give you some thinking time, looking at these two pictures, focusing again on ADHD, because that's just the area we've been looking at recently, around what these pictures might have to do with it. And then I'll link that again back into stress and anxiety. So if you just have a little think about what they may have to do with anxiety, we've got with ADHD, we've got the moths around the light bulb, and we've got the boy on the bike about to go down a hill. So I'm going to start with the moths around the light bulb. So something we talk a lot about in ADHD is young people having a singular focus, and where they may be able to really focus in on one area of something that's really appealing to them. The challenges may come when they are asked to change that focus or move on to something new, because that singular focus has really overtaken their whole level of enjoyment and what they're getting out of that activity. So really thinking about those transition points and how we might be able to break things down. We ask schools to go even further and think about, again, their use of visual resources and how they do that within the school, because we know that may work. Again, we talk about how they may be able to level things out and make sure there's a really clear objective to what's expected for that young person, and that it's more instant rather than it being made over a long period of time. Again, all of that kind of stuff may reduce that stress and anxiety of an activity finishing or changing. So there's lots more we go into detail there within our teacher sessions, but again, it's that singular focus, I think, is the key for this. Understanding that and understanding how we might help young people move from one thing to the next. The boy on the bike, about to go down a hill. With this, we talk about the brakes in the brain. So what we mean by that is how young people might be able to slow themselves down and get themselves into a place to learn or a place to access something that they need. And we know that for some people with ADHD, some of those challenges within inattentiveness and impulsiveness can have an impact on that. But again, thinking about things that may be able to support that young person to bring that brain to a slower way of operating and be able to make those right choices at the right time to reduce, again, that stress and anxiety. So, and we'll go on to talking about some of those interventions, but that's what that picture has to do with ADHD as well. And if you want to read more around ADHD specifically, there is a good book called ADHD Living Without Breaks. So some of the interventions linked into this. So we talk lots with ADHD around using a reward system and how this may link into supporting a young person, but some really key questions to consider here. So is it based on the individual rather than just pulling off, a generic style system? Does the young person understand it? How is it communicated between home and school? So home and school can be very different places for lots of young people, but how that may look in different environments. And sometimes, again, go back to the language we use with young people, really important. And how we can build on their strengths. So within a reward system, linking back to self-esteem, how can we build in some of the things that we know they're really good at, and so they can see their achievements through a reward system. So reward systems obviously can be made up of anything, but some of the principles there hopefully are clear. Having really clear boundaries around a system, so not stretching them every day, because that consistency is really important. Picking our battles, we talk lots about that in terms of, again, young people know where they are. The reward system is all about positive reinforcement, so making sure that doesn't link into any consequences to anything else. It is all about that positive reinforcement. Giving time, I think, is so important. Giving time for that system to work, and giving time for young people to understand it. Having responsibility. So sometimes we say about giving jobs to young people with ADHD, keeping them busy. And again, that may be particularly useful in those transition points where there isn't that kind of really clear singular focus. And you can keep that mind busy and reduce, again, any of that anxiety of, I'm not quite sure where I'm looking right now, I'm not quite sure where I'm at, and actually having something to focus on. Again, advice on medication I think is really key, not just taking your own advice from your own health professionals. I'm really strong with schools and saying that as schools, that's not something as professionals we should be saying in terms of they should or shouldn't be medicated. It's about making sure that the health professionals have those conversations with you. Something to focus on. So again, links into that responsibility. What is it that they may be? Maybe a doodle pad, fidget toy. Again, something that may help that young person. I remember in those difficult times where things may get very challenging for that young person, where they do feel very overwhelmed, where they do have heightened anxiety and heightened stress levels, that it's not personal. Those responses are not personal to us. That's a portrayal of how they're feeling at that moment. Clear speech, I've said enough about that, and you can link back to how we use clear speech. And visuals, again, some reoccurring messages there, and how we reduce that stress and anxiety of young people. So in lots of our work, especially our mental health focused work, we do link it back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We found it a really useful tool to work with young people with as well. And obviously, like any tool, There are pros and cons in terms of the research and bits that have gone into it. But for this, it really kind of does bring together some of the things that we've mentioned and understanding that stress and anxiety and where it has come from. So obviously the idea of Maslow is that everybody on this call, every young person will have their own needs, so their own pyramid or own triangle. And obviously everybody wants to be at the top of their triangle. That's when they're feeling their best and doing their best and being their best. But we know, it's not realistic to feel that every day we're going to be at the top of that triangle, because the needs below this are not always met, or are met in different ways or different amounts. And I think, again, it is about considering that when we work with young people, and again, that anxiety and stress. So those basic needs, and we've already spoke about with neurodiversity, especially, that food, and just for one example, or sleep could be affected in different ways. So again, having that understanding, having other professionals know about that as well, and that understanding of that may be where those responses are coming from, and what is some of the support we might be able to put in place. Safety, we did touch on that. What helps you to feel safe? Those questions are really important. Where are those safe spaces? The belongingness and love, so that peer-to-peer connection, which again we have touched on slightly, understanding that. And as you can see, self-esteem is that really important layer before we feel that fulfillment, and we can get to that top layer, and we can be our best and achieve our best. So understanding those self-esteem needs is so important. What does self-esteem mean, and what does it mean to that young person? And in some of our sessions, we've got young people to do their own triangles and think about their own needs, and think about, again, that it's a bit of a ladder. If we were to draw a ladder next to this, we are going up and down all the time, but if we could start to understand our needs a bit more, and professionals help and understand our needs, then that all links into feeling like we're climbing up that pyramid. So just some other things to touch on in terms of general mental health, and how that links into Maslow. So that feeling of safety, a question I'd get you to reflect on today if I was doing this in person is, what helps you to feel safe? It's so many different things that can impact on our safety needs. And obviously how safe we feel can then also translate into how anxious or how stressed we might feel about a certain situation. So safety, have we really understood safety? Positive praise, I think, again, linking back to self-esteem, positive praise needs to be delivered in different ways. So understanding, what does that mean for that young person? I think remembering what young people say is so powerful. It sounds very basic, doesn't it? But in a world where we can all be very busy and we've got so much going on in our own minds, it's very easy to maybe overlook. But just those clear messages. If a young person has maybe come to us on a Monday and said, my sister at the weekend got a bike and she's riding it, and then a week later, we ask that same young person, how's your sister getting on with that bike? How's she getting on with riding that bike? And just that connection, because we've listened to that young person, how valuable that can feel for that young person. Managing social media, I think, is a big one. We can't really talk about anxiety and stress and the impact on mental health without mentioning social media. So again, understanding how that might be impacting a young person, some of the mechanisms, again, in place to support that, are really important for us to understand. Having very clear boundaries as well, for that young person, I think is really clear, needs to be really clear, and we really need to understand that. Understanding change, we have mentioned, what does that change mean for that young person? But also we're focusing a lot, my role is obviously working with young people, but we also appreciate that if we are going to support young people, whether that be as a professional or a parent, we also need to look after ourselves and our own anxiety and stress levels as well. So we spoke very early on in this session about how that can sometimes be translated down. And so making sure we do a bit of self-reflection and focus on ourselves as well. So some of the strategies and interventions we've spoke about, how could that apply to you as an adult as well? And as I've said, where have the roots come from? Where have the roots of the anxiety and stress? Can we kind of go back to that? Can we go back to the seeds of where that's grown from and really understand it and what it means for each individual? So the last area I'm going to touch on briefly is masking, because it's something that our young people are really keen for us to bring in when any work that we do currently around mental health, that may link to stress and anxiety as well. So I think what we want to talk with all professionals and schools really about masking is making sure that when we do get feedback from different environments, that we believe it and we understand it, and we look to see how we might be able to reduce that. So again, really common example is, at schools where a young person, schools may say, we don't see any of that when they're at school. They get home and the parents may phone up and say, this is happening each day. And there's maybe that lack of belief between the two. And it's about making sure that we do believe that, that Coke bottle effect being, chuck all day and then that lid coming off when they're in their safe space. So again, just little interventions, things like having a young person have a break before they go home, having a diary, having a talk, some intervention on the ability level that will work for them, because we do need to understand things in different environments. Stimming is really important to understand. There's not one form of stimming. I think that's something that comes up a lot in terms of, we haven't seen a young person stim in this way, so they can't be stimming, when actually we know stimming can be very subtle. And when a child is anxious or they are stressed, there may be subtle signs of that stimming. So it's important that we understand that, because that might help us to identify when they're finding something difficult and help us to apply when we put the intervention in place. Again, how they're processing the different sensory information that's coming their way. Is there a change in their communication when they're going into a different environment? Again, have we understood that? Understanding their peer relationships, observing that and how they mix with friends, because again, that masking can be very tiring. And actually we might be able to pick up some of that through how they work with their friends. And again, considering our language, I think is really, really important. We've spoken like that the whole way through, but if a young person doesn't understand us, but is unable to tell us because they're masking that, they don't want to come across as maybe in their own way of perceiving it, and they're being silly or stupid, but actually have they understood language, I think is really, really important. So the questions for people to consider is thinking about, what level of support do we have in place when we talk about masking? Have we communicated effectively with that young person so they understand what is happening? And also the long-term effects. We know that, if young people are constantly masking, how tiring that can be for them and the impact that generally can have on their mental health. So really important to understand this area. So just some very quick support resources to touch on. I'm not going to go through them today just because of time, and I know you've got some other things happening today as well. There are loads of resources out there, and it can obviously seem a bit of a minefield. So we've just picked out the Autism Education Trust, the website. Social Stories are good to understand. The ADHD Foundation is another website. You've got Young Minds, which focuses on mental health. Autism.org website, and Mindshift, Positive Penguins, and SAM are all different apps that you can look at, again focusing on mental health and how potentially they may be able to reduce stress and anxiety amongst young people. Thank you for listening to me today. I hope you've managed to stay involved in it, even though I'm not here. If you've got any questions or want to find out more about any of our work following this, there's my email address. You can find more about us on our website, and you can follow us on social media as well by liking and following our page, which really helps us to raise awareness of what we're doing and help more young people to be heard. Thank you very much.